It is an invisible killer that causes millions of early deaths around the world. Is it time that we took the threat of air pollution more seriously? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello, I'm Andrew Wilson. We know about the dangers of a poor diet, lack of exercise, cigarettes and alcohol. What about air pollution?
Earth is now a planet of mostly city dwellers. More than half of us live in urban areas, according to the UN, but only 12% of cities meet World Health Standards of air quality. Every year, around 7 million premature deaths are caused by air pollution, according to the World Health Organization. That's 800 people dying every hour. Air pollution leads to higher rates of cancer, heart disease, stroke, and respiratory diseases. It mainly affects those who work and live in big cities, and for those with a lung condition, it is especially dangerous. The UN is using this year's World Environment Day to highlight the dangers and says we need to take action immediately. Is it time to start taking the threat of air pollution seriously?
Joining us at the roundtable today is Andrea Lee from the campaign group Client Earth, Audrey De Nazelle, an expert on air pollution from Imperial College London, Jonathan Steele, Chief Executive of AirSensa, which collects data about air pollution, and Lauren Andres, who studies air pollution and urban planning at the University of Birmingham. Thanks all for joining us today. I suppose even when we became aware of any kind of environmental degradation, air pollution was one of the first things we learnt about. And then it sits there as other concerns have kind of come and gone or grown or been tested in the court of public opinion, where air pollution seems to just sit there as something we kind of understand, but I would warrant that most of you think we don't get it quite as much as we should. I mean, Andrea, you're a straight campaigner. What are the challenges you face trying to get the concerns about air pollution out into the public sphere?
Well, I think it's like you say, for a long time, air pollution has been, and it's still called, an invisible health problem, purely because people will remember in the UK the times when we used to have what we called the Great Smogs back in the 1950s, when we were still burning coal in homes and factories that were right in the heart of our towns and cities. And that produces a smoke that you can't miss. And there are still photos and images across the world of places where they still are burning solid fuel, they're still burning coal, they're burning wood, and that creates a very visible, tangible problem. But in the UK, the Great Smogs caused a lot of public outcry. There were a lot of deaths caused by that. People rallied together, they campaigned and got the world's first Clean Air Act, which essentially banned the burning of coal from homes in towns and cities and took out those factories and those power stations from towns and cities, and really made a big change in the quality of our air. However, since then, what we've done is we've replaced all those coal fires with things like cars and buses and lorries that burn petrol or diesel, and they cause a different type of pollutant, much more difficult to see, much smaller particles, toxic gases. And that means that the air doesn't look as dirty, but it doesn't mean that, unfortunately, it's not harming our health, and it's difficult to understand.
The results aren't as immediate, so you don't have that sense of an emergency.
Well, in some cases, if the levels are, with the right combination of pollutants and the right levels, and if people especially are vulnerable already because either they're young, they're old, they've got chronic illnesses, people with existing breathing conditions or heart conditions, the effects can be quite immediate. But yes, for the wider population, relatively healthy, it's difficult to tell how the toxic air that we're breathing in our towns and cities is slowly damaging our health, and it's reducing the time that we have to live.
And Jonathan Steele, that's the world you live in, is looking to see what's going on that we can't see with the naked eye, and presumably what you're seeing isn't very encouraging.
No, that's exactly right. And the issue is that there are many, many, many sources of pollution. As Andrew says, there's cars, there's vans, trucks, lorries, buses and so on, but there's also central heating systems and agriculture and industry and so on, multiple different sources. And air pollution varies very rapidly across very small distances. So in order to truly understand it, you have to measure on a hyperlocal, real-time basis to build a map that really shows where air pollution is which allows people to avoid it or to take better decisions and so on. And that's something that really isn't done anywhere in the world properly today.
Does this chime in with the kind of work that you're now doing in terms of mapping out, Lauren, cities, looking at the prospects of how infrastructure and air pollution go together or should be coped with together?
No, absolutely. I think one of the key issues is we still tend to see air pollution as very siloed. And if we want to tackle air pollution, we really need to think in a systemic way. And hence why my work in urban planning is really coming here, and especially if you're looking at the global south, cities are expanding and we need to think differently, because otherwise we're going to reach very high level of air pollution. It's going to have massive and dramatic health effect. And we need to tackle this very differently. And it's not only at policy level, national level, international level, but also we need to tackle individuals. We need to change behaviors, change perceptions, because the key thing, as we already said, it's invisible. So we don't really see it, but also, and especially again, if you're looking at the global south, and even in our country, in the UK and in Europe, essentially there's other challenges, just essentially getting money, working. And for some people, they have no choice. They're going to be outside in a very polluted environment, and essentially they have no choice. And this is going to have very dramatic health impact on them, and we need to do something.
Is there a problem with the campaigning, Andrea? In terms of most of the environmental emergencies that we face at the moment, it's quite easy to identify the culprit in a single word or sentence. Plastic, CO2, fishing boats, industrial activity on various scales. Is there an added difficulty that air pollution is not a specific culprit? That we have to be fighting on different fronts?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in reality, no problem really has one source. So everything's very complex. But certainly, I think in terms of air pollution in places like the UK and other Western European countries, there are very specific things. And for instance, as we mentioned before, one big issue is road transport. And in particular, people will probably be aware of the Dieselgate issue that was highlighted by back in 2015 when the Volkswagen scandal emerged, which showed how for a long time manufacturers of diesel cars were producing vehicles that were much more polluting on the road than they were when they were being tested. So, we do have an urgent need to tackle emissions from road transport. And then another culprit really are governments. Because we really do have the solutions at the moment to deal with this problem and improve our air quality. But what we're missing is political will to tackle what can be very unpopular issues. Perhaps sometimes people want to be able to move around. They want the freedom of being able to drive wherever they want. And of course, in many cases, they don't have the alternatives. Like in the UK, in central London, you have great public transport. But if you go to towns and cities outside of London, there's been a failure to really invest in alternatives to give people proper options. So, we would say you urgently need to address emissions from road transport, and we need the politicians to take bold, ambitious decisions to invest the money and really help people and businesses to make the right choices.
We know that special interests have a role to play in all these kind of things. One of the moments that a lot of campaigners are looking for closer on the horizon than before, perhaps, is peak fossil fuel usage. In other words, at the point where alternatives compete with and start to reduce the need for fossil fuels. We're not there yet. We're still, every year that goes up. Is that a line of the sand for someone like you, Jonathan? Is that an important moment, or is that just purely a climate change issue?
Well, I think, it's certainly from a carbon emissions point of view, that you have to separate out, climate change from human health damaging air pollution. So air pollutants that are immediate and have an impact on human health today are a set of chemicals and particulates and so on, whereas climate change is really driven by carbon emissions. So in terms of energy production and energy usage, then yes, climate change can be addressed by moving to alternative sources. But it's slightly tangential to the air pollution problem, because people see today electric vehicles as being the solution to the problem, when actually that's just one classification of one source of air pollution. And actually electric vehicles are still polluting, just in a different way. And if you take it all the way back to sustainability sort of perspective, they're actually horrifically polluting in the long term. What they reduce a bit is tailpipe emissions in cities. So yeah, it's not as simple as it necessarily might appear.
Audrey, let's look at the human impacts of all this then. We know that people who live in cities like Delhi and Beijing have an identified health issue right there and then. We know that people living in congested parts of New York, Paris, London also have decisions they have to make. But of course, most people start their lives in cities. They have their children in cities before they become more affluent, more settled, perhaps and move out of the cities. So we've got a lot of babies in a lot of cities around the world, haven't we?
Yes, and that's the major challenge of air pollution. It really attacks us at every stage of our lives, and it's from the time when we're in our mother's womb, and it affects our birth weights, and it affects our time of birth and premature birth. Then when we're born and we're an infant, it prevents lung development. It even prevents our cognitive development. So our children, many of our children will not get full capacity for their lungs and for their brain capacity. And then as we grow older, it leads to cardiovascular disease, to respiratory disease. It has maybe even some links with diabetes, some links even with obesity, and of course lung cancer as well. So it affects us at every stage of our lives and pretty much every organ of our body as well. So it's definitely and undeniably an issue that needs to be tackled absolutely urgently. And I think we all agree on this specific issue. You were mentioning multiple culprits. It's true there are multiple culprits on air pollution. As Andrea said, there's also multiple solutions. And as Lauren mentioned, urban planning, urban design is definitely an approach that tackles the many different culprits of air pollution. So we can do so much more, and making air pollution, I think, visible is definitely a way to engage citizens in not only engaging them in better behaviors that are less contributing to air pollution by raising their awareness, but even more importantly, as we've mentioned already, the need to put pressure on politicians. And I think the work that Jonathan and colleagues do on making air pollution visible is really, we need to really target it so that people start putting pressure on politicians so that we together come up with those solutions that are more health promoting.
But it's not landing, is it? At a society level and a governmental level, it's not landing in the way that many would like to see it land. And indeed, often people who accept the message of the dangers of air pollution make their own personal arrangements. So if you're wealthy, for example, you can put air filters on your house. You can cover your garden with an enormous bubble if you want to. And these things are starting to happen because no activity is actually being made on behalf of the society.
Yeah, and I think we tend to have very narrow-sighted approaches to tackling air pollution. So we tend to have lots of, when we talk about air pollution, typically we talk about better fuel types, better emissions controls, and we don't necessarily talking about approaching the problem in a holistic and systemic way, as Lauren mentioned. And I think we tend to forget that the reason we want to address air pollution is because we want to improve health. And if we want to improve health, then we really need to engage much further politicians in creating the types of spaces that engage people into a healthier behavior. We have to focus not just on air pollution, but much beyond air pollution, embracing a much happier and healthier lifestyle.
I mean, Laura, how much of the work that you do is involved around fixing what's broken or anticipating what we can do coming down the road next?
It's really both, because I think we can't fix and find solutions for the futures without understanding what is happening. And I think the key thing is really we need to understand what are the different components of air pollution, what doesn't work essentially in the system, but then essentially try to look for very innovative and alternative ways to think about air pollution. And going back to what we were discussing, my key concern is the highly political nature of it. Because when you look, and if you look at the news a couple of days ago, we were mentioning Madrid. Madrid had a low emissions zone, and possibly they are thinking of scrapping it because it's not probably perceived as a top political priority, but also it's not essentially politically correct to get all the people to vote for you. And I think this is the real key concern. Air pollution shouldn't be a political item.
Jonathan, that sort of institutional political resistance that Lauren's talking about, is that something you identify with as well?
Oh, yes. Yes, I mean, we've been running this initially as a non-profit project and now as a commercial organisation for 7 years. And we're slowly seeing now a shift in perceptions at that level, largely because of pressure from campaigning organisations and from consistent media coverage ever since the VW scandal. We're certainly seeing it start to change, but there's very much a kind of being dragged kicking and screaming into the whole thing. And the problem is that some of the defences of that are based on the fact that, oh well, we have this data which shows it isn't that much of a problem, and we have this, and it's going down a little bit, and so on. And it's just not good enough to do that. And part of the problem is that you've got to be able to engage people and consumers and make them understand exactly what they're being exposed to. And today, with the measurement systems we have today, it's all kind of very averaged out. It's very modelled and averaged out, technically speaking. I mean, being very simplistic, but it kind of is. Whereas what we're really concerned about is identifying hotspots, short-term, very high levels, which occur at different places in a city. That is what causes a lot of health damage, as I'm sure Audrey would...
Well, I was going to say, the hotspots, so the rush hour in the centre of Madrid or the centre of Beijing will have an intense effect. But then many of the public would think, yeah, but after rush hour, it'll all drift away into the wind.
Yeah, so some of the studies that we've conducted have shown that even though people might spend about 6% of their time in transportation environments going to and from places, that leads up to about a quarter of what they actually inhale in terms of air pollution, because the air pollution is so high in transportation microenvironments, whether you're in a car, which is where the concentrations are the highest, or whether you're cycling or walking or in public transport, also very high. You even though you don't spend so much time there, the concentrations are so high, and of course, especially if you're physically active, cycling or walking, your inhalation is huge. Now, I do want to point out, though, before scaring everybody off and thinking we shouldn't be walking and cycling, that of course the physical activity benefits that you get from walking and cycling are known to by far outweigh any of the risks associated with inhaling air pollution.
Why is that?
So, because the physical activity has such strong benefits. We live in a society where people don't engage sufficiently in physical activity, and it's very hard for people to find time going to the gym, going exercising. And so when you can integrate physical activity as part of your daily lives and can just spend half an hour a day just walking to work or cycling to work and back or school, then you accrue this regular physical activity, which is so important for our health. So even though, yes, we do inhale more air pollution when we're in those transportation microenvironments, these are just outweighed by the strong benefits of physical activity.
We're moving, yes, go on.
That's absolutely right. But the interesting thing is, and I wanted to see if Lauren would comment on this, is many cities today, not just in the UK, but around the world that we see, are starting to build things like cycle lanes, superhighways and so on. But they're tending to do it on major routes. So they're actually restricting traffic to put in a cycle lane, which actually increases traffic and therefore increases pollution, and then channeling cyclists down there. And that is an urban planning issue, surely. It's an integrated transport.
It's a difficult debate because, of course, if you want to encourage cycling, you need to be able to provide as direct routes as possible. And so there's a reason why we put cycle lanes on those direct routes. Now, of course, if you were to put cycle lanes in more quiet streets, you could reduce 30 to 50% of your concentrations of air pollution. So it makes sense. But on the other hand, you have to be able to find ways through better urban design practices so that it's easy, feasible, convenient, safe to be able to cycle from place to place. And that's where you'll get both air pollution benefits.
A city like London, we've got what we've got in terms of our routes. And all the European cities, going back to their medieval histories, that's what we've got to deal with. So that's the old. And in terms of the new, of course, you can bear that in mind if you're creating new infrastructures and planning and so on. Now, as I understand it, the mega cities of the future, a lot of them are going to be in places like Africa, for example. That's where we're going to see the bigger concentrations of kind of colonisation and people moving to those. Is there an opportunity or a disaster waiting to happen?
I think it's a clear opportunity, but my key concern currently is it's probably not going to happen if it continues being like this. Because if you look at the visions for some of the mega cities, for example, in Nigeria, you look at fantastic green cities where everything is walkable, etc. When you get in the ground and you actually see what's happening, you essentially have 4 highways built around it. Everything is essentially linked to road, mainly, and there's a lack of thought, especially around public transport. And I think it goes back on the point about cycling, is you can improve cycling, but if you don't think about public transport in addition, and essentially a public transport that work, this is where you're having a concern. Because if you're looking at South Africa, for example, Brazil, they pushed a lot BRTs, which are specific networks for buses. But the thing is, they're actually struggling to run them. And some of them are actually not running properly, or they're not essentially responding to the needs of the local communities. Hence, people are not using it. They're still using forms of taxis, or they're still walking or cycling. So again, it comes back to the thing that this needs to be really thought about in a very systemic way. Because if you only look like, okay, we're going to do new cities and we're going to promote walkability, if you don't look at the big picture, it's just not going to work.
So this is the classic dilemma of technology offering solutions if it's got the permission to do so politically and the funding to do so to actually create, versus the mindset of the population at large.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, you know, if we just rely on technology, then that's not going to solve the problem. Part of the reason that we're in the problem that we are in places like the UK and other countries is because what we were doing in the 2000s is trying to move people over to diesel vehicles, because diesel was seen as can be a more efficient fuel. So as a way to tackle climate change emissions, what the UK government and other governments wanted to do is encourage more people to take up diesel vehicles, even though they knew that they were much more polluting and harmful for our health. But they kind of crossed their fingers and hoped that these diesel vehicles wouldn't clean up. And after 10, 15 years, we've seen that that's actually not really happened in the way that we were hoping to. So it's not good enough to just think, right, this technology, replacing with this technology, as Jonathan was saying earlier, will be the solution. But you know, technology can help, and if you have a comprehensive approach, so we start thinking about not just cleaning up vehicles, but also reducing the number of vehicles, and how can we get people actually even traveling less with technology. You know, a lot of people don't have to travel for meetings. They could work at home or work closer to home. You know, then how can they travel? They could take public transport, they could walk, they could cycle. And all those things also create additional benefits, as was being pointed out. You know, if people are traveling less, you know, the stress that people get from congestion, the exposure to pollution, the noise, the road traffic accidents, but then you get them moving more, perhaps locally. You start building also a sense of community, much better places for people to work and live.
So these technological solutions are definitely the low-hanging fruit, and that's why because it doesn't impinge on anybody's freedom and ability to drive, and that seems to be sacrosanct for many people. We are supposed to be allowed to drive, and that's the way it is. And that's why changing the vehicle technology is an easy political approach. But if we can start making that vision of a beautiful, healthy, welcoming, human-scale city possible from the start in places where cities are growing, such as the work that's being done right now by Lauren, but also even in the UK, even in London, and in cities around the world. I think we really need to think about how to create this vision so that people actually want to live in
If you're talking about visions, then, I mean, is there an issue that generations don't have the memory of the generation before them? So if my grandparents, for example, were to walk into London now, it would probably smell disgusting to them. But every new generation starts from a different base. So we're selling an age-old problem to people who have only grown up with the tail end of it. I
think it's vision, it's culture. I mean, just to give an example, in Sweden, people are very aware about climate. So by essence, essentially, if they need to travel to a city far away, they will decide to take the train and not fly. In other countries, it would be the opposite. And currently, there's some discussions in France to essentially scrap all the local flights. So, for example, between Paris and Marseille, and to force people to take high-speed train because it's here, and maybe it will take an hour more, but maybe essentially going to take you the same amount of time. But it's really changing the cultures. And I think it goes back to education, perceptions, and really to try to sell to the younger generation what is a good quality of life. And if you're not becoming environmental aware, essentially you're going to live in a world which is not going to be livable. So it's about technologies, but it's really about people. And within the people, you have the people who live there, you have your children, but of course you have the politicians, as we said before.
So do you sense more of a buy-in now, the people you're working with or who seek your advice, than, say, 7 years ago?
At a government level, a little bit more, but a lot of it is because they're having to tick boxes, particularly in places which work closely with the UN or the World Bank or other such supranationals, where they're requiring that as part of a vision. But actually implementing is something different. And I absolutely agree. The vision is incredibly important in this, and bringing people on board is very important, consumers and citizens on board. But governments need to take some very practical steps. They need tactical steps. And the difficulty is, as Lauren pointed out earlier on, a lot of them look very politically unpleasant. Voters don't like them and so on. So we need to move to an environment really where we are identifying good, effective interventions that can be taken as first steps to doing things, rather than what's happening at the moment. You see patchwork all around the world, people doing different things.
How do we get policy?
Well, I think we get policy when politicians are prepared to be bold and be brave and think long term and think about people's health and the savings that they can be making to the economy in terms of health costs, but also the benefits. Because in the UK, what we should be looking to do is become a world leader in producing the sort of solutions, the clean tech solutions, the policies that other countries are also wanting to find for them. So we need politicians to realise that this is not just a minor inconvenience. It's a real problem for people, and they need to show leadership for them.
That's great. Thank you all for coming in, joining us on Roundtable today. Thanks to all our guests. That's it for now, but you can always see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search TRT World Roundtable. But for now, from me and the team, goodbye.